Well, good afternoon. My name is Jeff Powell, and my friend and colleague Guy Charles and I are going to talk about the role of faith in the public sphere. Each of us is going to talk for a few minutes, then we're going to probably ask one another a question or two, and then we'll just throw it open for general discussion. This is a fascinating and interesting topic. I come to it professionally, both as a lawyer, and some of you know, teach constitutional law, and as someone who has an appointment in the divinity school here at Duke, and therefore spend part of my working time in a professional school of Christian theology. And I'm going to be inescapably, and you'll see why I say that, speaking from the perspective that is not just professionally but personally mine, although I hope that what I have to say will be of interest to people who don't share that same perspective. And I'm going to use a word to characterize myself, where I'm coming from, and to speak about other things as well that I want to define to begin with. I'm going to speak out of a sectarian perspective. And by that I mean not anything fancy, so don't go look up Max Weber or something like that, but simply that I am speaking out of my own particular religious context. I happen to be Christian, and that will be what I'm saying, and indeed part of the gist of what I have to say is that that's an inescapable part of who I am and who many other people, well, different identities, and there's something similar for many other people in this republic. It's entirely fitting to associate a conversation about this topic with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King had a PhD in Christian theology. He was an ordained Christian minister. It is very clear that his religious beliefs were a central, or perhaps the central, motivating factor leading him to play the very important role he played in American public life. And it's also unmistakable if you go back and reread much of what King had to say publicly. It's inescapable the way in which what he said, not just what he said, but how he said it, was couched in terms that came directly out of his own religious tradition. And therefore he was both acting on the basis of and speaking in language that was not shared by many of his fellow citizens. Okay, now what is the role of religious, to use the word faith probably is something of a mistake because that's not how some religions would characterize it, but religious commitment. What is the role of religious commitment in American public life? I am of two minds, and my position, you may indeed conclude, is basically a muddle. In fact, I think myself it's sort of a muddle, although I think myself also an inescapable one. Let's begin with the Constitution. Article 6 of the Constitution states that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. And I myself take that to actually be a principle that extends beyond the technical reach of its words, which refers to public offices or positions. In this republic, you cannot be asked to lay aside your views on religious matters, whatever they may be, ranging from whatever to whatever, including thinking religion is all a bunch of nonsense. Whatever your views on the matter, you cannot be asked to lay aside those views as the price for admission to the public sphere. The public sphere is open to all, irregardless of their religious perspectives or lack thereof. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the Constitution in the First Amendment says, as applicable to the states through the 14th, says that government shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And there too I take there to be a principle that is not simply the narrow, or quite broad, but narrower legal rule. The public sphere, government, is not to be turned into a tool for the advancement of religious views or practices. So as I read our Constitution and our constitutional culture more generally, we have two principles that bear on this question of religious commitment in the public sphere. Religious folk and non-religious folk and folk of all conceivable views on religious matters may freely participate in the public sphere, and religious folk, and no doubt anti-religious folk too, may not advance their religious views through government. Now, if religious commitment were simply a matter of choice that you could lay down at will and then pick up again, this would not seem to, these two principles would not perhaps come into conflict. Famously, President John F. Kennedy, when he was running for election, seems to have essentially taken that view, attempting to quell fears that as a Catholic, Kennedy would be subservient to the Vatican or something of the sort. President Kennedy, or then Senator Kennedy, came very close to saying that, well, I'll just disregard my Catholic views whenever I'm acting as president. I'll lay aside my Catholicism as the price of admission to this public office. The Supreme Court justices sometimes seem to view religion in this fashion. Well, that may be possible for some religious perspectives, but it is not the experience, it's not my experience or understanding, and it is not what religious commitment means to a great many religious folk belonging to any number of different religions. Religious commitment is not just a choice, something that one picks up and puts down willy-nilly, but it is the lens through which one sees the world. It is part of one's identity. It can't be laid aside. One can be faithful or not to those religious commitments, but you can't leave them at the door. If Article 6 is to mean what it seems to promise, I believe that all of us have to live with legislators, executive officers, judges, and fellow citizens who believe and act on the basis of beliefs that we believe to be silly, superstitious, blasphemous, or in some cases, some of us think, literally damnable. That's the price of having the public sphere open to all persons, regardless of religious viewpoint. The U.S. Constitution, in other words, as I understand it, and the social experiment which is the United States of America, which often is viewed as the paradigmatic product of Enlightenment thinking in politics, the United States and the Constitution reject the ideal of many Enlightenment thinkers, that is, of a political society that has been freed from the irrationalities of religion. No. Well, but the Constitution has a First Amendment as well as an Article 6. Government is not, to repeat myself, is not supposed to become the tool of sectarian goals or the means of advancing sectarian goals. I am free to think and live in accordance with the Book of Common Prayer, and you with the Torah or the Quran or the Upanishads or the Atheist Manifesto or whatever. We're all free to guide our lives by whatever, religiously or non-religiously. But when we come together to do the common work of the Republic, well, you see where I'm going. Our shared commitment to open the sphere to persons of any and all religious persuasion opens the door to people who cannot help but act on the basis of religious commitment, and that's the kind of thing that seems questionable or indeed wrong under the First Amendment. So what is the solution? My answer is, and this is where I've come deliberately and self-knowingly muddled, my answer is that there is no solution on the level of theory. These really are conflicting commitments in the abstract. Now, sometimes we tend to think, well, no, even accepting that religion is something you have to, you can't lay aside, surely that, in the things that we really deal with in the public sphere, that needn't cause us problems. We're not going to strike down, a court should not strike down a law prohibiting murder, even if it were shown that every last member of the legislature that voted for the law did so because she thought it's the will of God. After all, there are non-religious grounds for having laws prohibiting murder. Well, that's because those kinds of examples are too easy. Let's think back to the time that Dr. King was playing his incredibly important historical role. Not many people are going to publicly defend racial segregation in 2009. But when Dr. King was alive, there were a great many people who believed that it was the will of God that black people and white people and other sorts of people remain separate on racial lines, and for whom Dr. King's speeches and his actions and his motives were an affront, not just to sentiment, but to religious conviction. They were an attempt by Dr. King and others to impose Dr. King's theology on everybody else through the public sphere, through the action of government. It's easy to forget that because most all of us think that, regardless of our religious views, he was right on the particular issue. But just choose an issue where we're not all going to be in agreement. There are people in this room, I am almost certain, who believe that the current state of American abortion law is an affront to the will of God, either because it allows the murder of the innocent or because it permits interference with the God-given autonomy of the pregnant person. And when religious people act, at least some religious people are acting, regardless of what you and I might say or other justifications, they are acting on the basis of religious conviction, and they are attempting to advance the goal of their religion. Now, the only solution, I think, is a practical one, albeit a messy one. On the one hand, and here's the half of me that's the card-carrying member of the ACLU, sectarian conflict does indeed pose an enormous threat to civil peace and to the functioning of a liberal republic. The instinct to exclude the manifestation of religion from public life to the maximum extent possible is or has a realistic and democratic basis in fear of what sectarian strife can do to a society. On the one hand, there's that Article 6, that beautiful Article 6 principle that in this society no one is kept out because of their religious perspectives from their own chosen role in the public sphere. The analogy, and I owe this fittingly to my wife, the analogy that seems to me to work for me is that other most potent of commitments, personal love. No one expects a public actor, including a voter or a citizen acting in some other capacity as a citizen, no one expects someone acting in the public sphere to lay aside his or her personal affections and connections. On the other hand, those personal affections and connections may sometimes be ones that require me to recuse myself, literally if I'm a judge, and in metaphorical ways otherwise, to step back from actually acting. I may be obliged, not because I'm giving them up, but precisely because I won't give them up, not to, for example, make a recommendation, participate in a judgment or decision, or something of the sort. If I can't do that, if that would require me to sacrifice my personal commitments, my loved ones, then my honorable course of action is to exit the public position. And I think religious people and of all sorts have the same, or at least an analogous, option. Not to act, to recuse oneself where acting would be to improperly impose religious belief, and if that's not possible in the particular situation, don't take the job or get rid of the job. Now, as I've already suggested, and I doubt many of you will disagree, most of us in the year 2009 think that Dr. King was right to take the stance and take the actions that he took. And I suspect that a great many of us, even including people who don't agree with his religion, are not co-religionists, as I am, are comfortable with the language that Dr. King used, even though it clearly comes out of his religious tradition. But I wonder whether that's because Dr. King was right in his methods or right in his outcome. Precisely because we agree with him on what he tried to do, we are willing to perhaps not pay much attention to things about the way he did it that might be questionable. Now, my own view is that King successfully negotiated the non-theoretically ascertainable line between acting improperly and acting properly in this matter because of the role of his religion. But the task is difficult, and very few of us are Dr. King. So I feel myself muddled, feel myself confused, and feel myself without a great deal of confidence about how to answer many of the concrete, practical questions that our topic today brings up. Thank you.
My name is Guy Charles. I'm one of the latest members of the Duke community, having recently agreed to join the faculty, and part of the reasons for doing so are for people like Jeff. I said to Jeff when we were talking about who should go first, I said, well, the smartest academic should go first, and clearly the smartest academic did. So it's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you about some of this stuff and to be a member of this community. So many of you are familiar, it seems to me, with likely to be or should be with a recent debate about faith and politics. And in my view, I think this is becoming an increasingly important question in American politics. So Reverend Jeremiah Wright, Reverend Rick Warren, Reverend John Hagee, I believe is the way you pronounce it, the Mormon Church, the Black and Latino churches with respect to California Proposition 8, the ballot initiative to ban gay marriage in California. These and many issues have brought to the fore the question of the role of religion in public life and the role of religion in politics. I approach these questions similarly to Jeff from the perspective of a constitutional law scholar, but also from someone who takes faith claims very seriously and who take my own faith very seriously. So from my perspective, both as an individual and as a con law person, religious freedom is an important fundamental democratic principle. And I define religious freedom not just as freedom to worship or not, that is, right, freedom to be religious or not, pursuant to the dictates of one's conscience or one's religion, but also the freedom to define oneself consistent with one's religion. I've always been influenced by Mill's two conceptions of liberty, liberty defined in contraposition to government restraint, but also liberty as tolerance by society. Thus, religious liberty is not simply freedom from government interference on the exercise of religion or not, but liberty to be religious or not, to define oneself as a Muslim, as a Jew, as a Christian, as a Buddhist, etc., or not define oneself that way, and not to have that held against you in the public square. So it's not just, from my perspective, I agree with Jeff, an Article 6 principle, but I also think there's a larger democratic principle about what it means to be a society committed to religious liberty. Thus, from my perspective, if religious freedom, defined as freedom to be religious or not, is to be meaningful, it must also be accompanied there must also be accompanied by a cognate principle, the principle that the society is tolerant. It must also be accompanied by an additional principle, it seems to me, and that principle must be that in the public square, the only arguments that are legitimate are those that are made in non-sectarian terms. That is, there ought to be commonality and universality to public appeals. Public appeals, if they are to be legitimate, ought to be as broadly based as possible, or in any event, they ought to be secular appeals. And I think this principle is particularly important because if one is going to have a democratic society that is committed, in some senses, to the rule of law, then the rule of law must have, right, almost by definition, the rule of law must be an appeal that is, in principle, a one based upon commonality of principles, whether it's constitutional principles, whether it is what is good for the society principles, but not sectarian principles. By contrast, I would say in the house of worship, people of faith should make whatever appeals are consistent with their faith, and they should be free to do so. They should also make appeals to their congregants to be involved in public life. And I think that is consistent with religious liberty and religious freedom. So from this perspective, the black church has historically ignored the line between religion and politics in the pews, and in my view, rightly so. That is, in one's house of worship, however define that place, whatever is consistent with one's religion can be stated, and the appeals can be made from that perspective, and they could be made in one's religious terms. But as a question of application, consider the case of the two reverends, Reverend Wright and Reverend Warren. It seems to me that both of those events raise a tremendous amount of controversy, one more so than the other, Wright more so than Warren. When people heard the claims of Reverend Wright, there seemed to be a sense that this was against the principle of religious freedom or religious liberty. And in my view, I think the public had it backwards. I think any constitutional principle that would interfere with a person to say whatever they want in their pulpit or their house of worship is a violation of the First Amendment. Similarly, any norm that would punish public advocacy from the pulpit should not be encouraged, and I think is a violation of the principle of religious liberty. By contrast, my view of prayer at a public secular event seems to me to violate either the spirit of the First Amendment, if not indeed the First Amendment itself. And so then what about the civil rights movement, and what about Dr. King? Two views on Dr. King. First is that it seems to me that as a society we're thinking differently about religious appeals in the public square. I think at the time of Dr. King, the society was much more receptive to religious appeals in the public square, and thus one can blur the line a bit. I think there was much more commonality with respect to those appeals in a way that I think is no longer so. Secondly, I think what's interesting about King is, and Jeff talked a lot about this, is the way that he navigated those lines. So one of my favorite King events is the letter from Birmingham jail, right? And the great thing about that is it's an appeal to co-religionists, right, made on those terms. So when one is talking to one's fellow religionists, whatever that may be, right, there is obviously a language, there are obviously principles, there are obviously arguments that resonate with those individuals that do not resonate and are ineffective and perhaps should not resonate with others on the outside. But also, King was very aware when he was making arguments to the public at large. So, for example, he drew fairly broadly on constitutional principles, on the meaning of equality and what the Constitution means and ought to mean. And those, I think, are very interesting, especially from the perspective of a preacher, right? So it wasn't simply an argument and language used that appealed to religionists, but an argument that appealed to the public at large and made, and sometimes in stark secular and constitutional terms. So it seems to me that King was motivated clearly by his faith, there's no doubt about that, and often, if not always, in sectarian environments made fairly strong sectarian appeals, but also often in more public environments made broad appeals that resonated with the larger principles, the larger secular principles of the society. So this would lead me to the conclusion that the best interpretation of the role of faith in public life would be that if one is going to make a public appeal, that it ought to be secular and non-sectarian, but within the dictates of one's house of worship. That is, right, this is why in the California context, in my view, protesting houses of worship, it seems to me, violate the principles of liberty. But then on the other hand, a prayer at a public gathering also seems to me to violate principles of liberty. And perhaps I'm too young and not smart enough to be muddled. But I would think that, at least in principle, there is a line to be drawn and defended. Thank you.
Well, Guy, I agree with much of what you said, but there's a point of sharp disagreement. I think the second of your two rules, the one that says that arguments in the public sphere must be non-sectarian, I think that does precisely what I'm saying some religious people, I'm not saying for all religions, or it's not analytic to the notion of religion, but for at least many religious folk, that's precisely what they cannot do. They cannot say, or at least not say truthfully, well, the reason I oppose the war in Iraq, or for that matter, the reason I support the war in Iraq is for the following sets of reasons. No, the real reason is because it is contrary to the will of God, because it is an unjust war, and it is the will of God that unjust wars not be undertaken. And when you tell that person that you can't make that argument, you're telling her that she either must say nothing or she must equivocate or just lie. And I think that is contrary to my understanding of religious liberty. So what do you have to say to the religious person who says, I can't, I'm sorry, I hear what you're saying. I understand that my fellow citizens who don't share my religious views will not be terribly persuaded by me, may be offended at me and at what I say. I understand this may not be effective, maybe counter-effective, but I have to say it.
Mm-hmm. Well, a couple of responses. The first thing is, look, not all claims about religion are taken seriously in the public square, right? So if I walk into the classroom and I say, my religious views tell me, go back to King, my religious views tell me that, blacks ought to sit on the right-hand side and whites ought to sit on the left-hand side, and everybody else who's neither black or white should sit in the middle, right? Everyone would say, or mostly everyone would say, this is a violation of either statutory principles or at least our conceptions and norms of equality, right? So simply because one makes a religious claim and says that it is based upon religion, no matter how sincerely you believe it, doesn't mean that it has to or will be taken seriously in the public square, right? So the fact that this person has a sincerely held religious belief and the fact that they would like to express it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be that it has to be taken at face value on the public square. So that's the first answer. The second answer, I think, in some ways, Jeff, you certainly clearly talked about this toward the end of your presentation, where you said, well, the religious person might have to make a choice between recusing themselves, right, not taking the position or stepping away from the position, if they can't walk that line. Now, what surprised me a little bit about that conclusion is that it seemed to violate the principle that you started with at the beginning about the role of the importance of involving religious people in the public square, and that per Article 6, it shouldn't be held against you one way or the other, right? That is, if all religious people are of the view that, okay, I have to make a choice, I either have to recuse, right, or find some secular way of appealing, right? So recusal would be your side, right? A secular argument would be my side, then that would take out, and if they certainly went on from your perspective, right, and the argument you were making, that would take out religious folks at all from the public square if recusal is traditionally the best option that they have available to them. So, I would say, 2 points. One would be an assertion of religion is not a trump card. Right. As important as I take my own faith, one ought to recognize that it isn't a trump card. It is a claim that ought to be evaluated against all other principles. Secondly, I think recusal, it seems to me, is a harsh remedy. Now, again, one must do it pursuant to one's conscience. So there's for some people that might be the preferred remedy. But it would seem to me appealing on the basis of shared principles as opposed to on the basis of principles that are only shared by a subsection of the population is a less harsh remedy than recusal, notwithstanding the fact that for some people it may simply have to be recusal.
Well, that's a thoughtful response, Guy. I suppose two just thoughts, footnotes. Mm-hmm. One is that, as my analogy was meant to suggest, the proper thing to do for the individual religious person is going to vary depending on circumstances. And take the analogy of personal connections. I take it there's no problem at all if my wife runs for public office and me voting for her or telling other people that I hope they vote for her too. On the other hand, if I'm working for the Department of Justice, I can't lobby. There's an anti-nepotism rule, and even if there weren't a formal rule, it might very well be quite improper. I might think it a wrong and dishonorable thing to do to lobby that she be hired. So I think there's similar kinds of analogies in with respect to religious belief. My second thought is, but there is this difference between your position and mine that leaves me still more comfortable with mine, agreeing with you that
you
decide
think about mine a lot more.
The recusal option, as I see it in the religious kind of context, is really one that I think is you apply it to yourself. Mm-hmm. You make the decision, okay, this is recognizing that I am guaranteed in this society the full right to participate. There may be times when the only way I could participate on a particular thing is to act or speak religiously, and I don't think I should be doing that. I think it would be wrong of me to do it. Mm-hmm. Whereas your principle says that, it sort of comes from the outside to the religious person that says, you can talk and you can hold what beliefs you want, but either you mustn't say them, couch them in religious terms, mm-hmm. or the rest of us will smile and not take you seriously.
Right. No, that is a very thoughtful point. And my response is, I think there's a problem of association no matter what. There's a problem of authority no matter which way you cut it. That is, so if I'm in a public square and someone stands up and says, okay, now let us all bow our heads, we must pray, right? That seems to me to impose a religious requirement upon a set of individuals who may not share that requirement, right? So I understand and agree with your argument that my rule would impose a requirement upon an individual. That is, whether, and I'm not saying that my rule is ought to be constitutionalized but certainly would be a societal principle, right? But nevertheless, a societal principle in a lot of respects can be more powerful than a positive statutory rule. So I think it is still an important, still is a powerful rule. That is, I would concede that. But it seems to me that your method would also interfere with autonomy, right? By providing instances in which folks who don't share a religious perspective or don't share any religious perspective would be imposed upon by someone who think that it is their right or their belief or their right to speak in religious terms and to impose statutes, norms, and rules on the basis of their religious understanding. And to me, that is a greater harm than saying, if you come to the public square, you can speak, you can act, but you must act in a way that appeals to public values. To me, it's a greater harm on autonomy to permit individuals to impose laws, statutes, norms on the basis of religious views than to ask them to speak, but do so in ways that are consistent with our public norms and values. And within your tradition, within your room, so to speak, you could say whatever you want, right? Sort of sometimes the way that we treat kids, which may not be a good analogy, but we say, look, if you're in your room and you want to trash your room, fine. But when you come into our living room, right, this is our living room, and there are rules that apply. But there's a place for complete autonomy, and it is your room. And I don't care what you do with it because you're going to live there. I'm not coming in. But when you're in our living room, there are norms that apply. And I think to me, that's a reasonable democratic compromise.
Shall we throw it open?
Yes.
Other folks?
I'd like to throw in a dimensional aspect to the concept of the public square and ask y'all to respond to this. Because the public square is an awful big term, and I don't think it's quite a flat entity. It seems to me that at least you could make a distinction between the deliberative public square, in which people are engaged in debate with one another, say a candidates forum or Congress debating whether to pass some law, that kind of thing, and the prescriptive public square, in which, for example, Congress does pass a law and says that we will declare that every year Eid al-Adha, the day in which Ibrahim sacrificed Ishmael, is now a public law. However, two different spheres, I think both of them public. Would either of you concede that perhaps your point of view is more fitted to one than the other?
I certainly would. Oh, yes.
And I certainly wouldn't. You first.
If a federal district judge imposes a certain sentence on the criminal defendant standing before her and says, I'm giving you the maximum sentence permissible under the statute because you have violated the will of God, I believe that to be clear reversible error. There is a rule against that, and the rule is one that the society enforces. If a religious person says, whenever that's the case, I'm going to have to do that, then I think she ought not become a federal judge, because she's not going to be able to do her job as the society expects the job to be done. On the other hand, when someone stands up in Congress and says, abortion is, and then fill in the blank, an offense to the law of God or the God-given right of any pregnant woman, whichever. When that person stands up and says, and therefore I am voting for or against this legislation because we must go as far as possible, and in the end I hope we get all the way towards following God's will, unlike what I think Guy's position is, I would say that's fine. Now, that may not be smart politically, and it may be that, and I would think it also perfectly appropriate for the religious person to do what I'm calling recusal, to say to herself, I'm just not going to, if I have to put it in religious terms, I'm just not going to speak to it. But I think there it's fine for the person to act and speak religiously.
Yeah, I mean, a serious answer is yes. I agree that it's not a flat space. So, for example, I think the easy case is a forum at a public university about the role of religion. Right? So if my first answer were serious, then one would say, well, no, it should all be public appeals, and that's not a nonsensical approach. So I think that's completely right that there are dimensions that are worth taking into account. I am a little bit more comfortable with a public official running for office who says, I believe my religion tells me to do X, Y, or Z, because I think that there's a democratic mechanism to address that, hopefully. So I'm less troubled by that, more troubled by an individual who is an elected official who enacts a law on the basis right? Because I don't think that there's a mechanism for addressing that, except sort of really difficult ones, such as a recall or getting another legislature in. So I certainly agree that, and I think that's a very nice point, that there are dimensions that raises the stakes about the problem of autonomy and liberty to worship or not. And I think that's the principle is some moves are much more harmful to autonomy and liberty in certain dimensions, and others are less harmful. So the serious answer is clearly that's right. But since Jeff took one position, I felt that I should at least try the other.
Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering, as we start out talking about this, everything is couched in the Constitution and things that we must do or must not do. Shall pass a law establishing religion, that there shall be no religious test. As we get to sort of what role religion actually plays, we're talking in terms of what people should do, what individuals should be doing. Is there anything that an individual must do? I guess the reason I'm thinking of it is
An individual must?
That an individual must do. Because I feel like, a lot of people may hear these arguments and say, well, that's great, but if I can get 51% of the people decide with me that this particular action is the will of God, then I win. Is there anything that we must do, that we're bound in the same way that we would be bound in the Constitution?
Well, the part where I'm muddled is whether what I characterize as sort of a societal norm ought to be understood and interpreted as a constitutional norm. So, from my perspective, an individual must not, as a societal norm, engage in the public square explicitly as a sectarian. You could grant the caveat of different dimensions might apply, and therefore it's worse in some cases and less worse in other cases. So again, to go back to the prayer at the inauguration, it would seem to me that that's something that if I were speaking to the various reverends that are going to be involved in that event, I would say, gee, that would strike me as something that you must not do. Now, I don't think that I'm not at all prepared to say that ought to be a constitutional norm. And the way that I must be respectful of others is not a constitutional norm. It is a societal principle, most oftentimes breached than adhered to. But I think there clearly are constitutional principles. There's no doubt about that. But when you're getting to the outer edges, which I take to be the aim of your question, I think it's a lot more difficult to say that these ought to be either statutory or constitutional norms.
I don't think this disagrees with Guy, but my answer would be yes, there are things that individuals should do, quite apart from what the positive law of the society may be. I would think it entirely logical for somebody to say that, I personally think that it's the will of God or the proper way of conducting oneself under the eightfold path or whatever one's religious norm is. I think that that requires that abortion be forbidden, allowed, whatever. And yet then conclude, well, I think, given the circumstances, I think I would be really violating the kind of openness and unwillingness to impose religious belief that our society is committed to, so I'm not going to do that, even though I think that's in principle the right thing. So yeah, I think individuals, I talked about constitutional, and Guy did too, constitutional matters, but I think that there's more to the Constitution than just law that's enforced. There's a culture of constitutional liberty.
Yes.
My background is not law, but cultural anthropology, so I think that's somewhat where I'm framing my question. Our courts of law, they're to uphold our Constitution. There's the Judeo-Christian Bible. Before you can speak in, you're sworn in with your hand on a Judeo-Christian Bible. Our president is going to be sworn in with his hand on a Judeo-Christian Bible. The opening session of Congress starts with, "And now we will pray." There's a prayer to start the opening session of Congress. And I would like your comments on the role of the Bible in our courts of law and in our government.
Tough question, you first.
Well, there are two answers. For me, there seem to always be two answers. Never mind. As a matter of current constitutional law, most everything you're talking about is constitutional. The rationales somewhat differ. I would lump them all together in general as these are all just examples of ceremonial deism. They're just the kind of civic piety of the United States that, between you and me, no one takes very seriously as having theological content. They're just part of our rituals. And I accept that as being the current state of constitutional law. I myself find them all offensive. And in fact, I find them offensive from my sectarian perspective. Christians, at least Christians in the tradition the sub-tradition that I am part of, do not pray to whom it may concern. They pray to the most holy and blessed and undivided Trinity, which is about as sectarian as you can get. You can't have a prayer that's a true prayer, that isn't at least implicitly addressed to that triune God. And therefore the whole enterprise of ceremonial deism seems to me not just irritating, but actually blasphemous. So I would, from a sectarian religious perspective, not have them do that. Sorry.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with Jeff on both counts. That is, on the count of thinking of those as religious exercises. I remember going to an event. I think it was a carry event, and they opened up the event in prayer. And I'm like, well, who are we going to pray to, and why are we praying here? Now, it was completely meaningless, right? It was thoroughly symbolic. But as a person who takes prayer very seriously, I couldn't have been more offended at the fact that here I am at this event, and we're going to have this. I'm going to participate in a religious exercise, and clearly it was not my religious exercise from my perspective. So I think that, and I think as a matter of current constitutional doctrine, they're fine. Although they may not. I think if the course of the court changes, if the composition of the court changes, I think they'll be increasingly less fine, because in a lot of ways they're anachronisms that don't do much except sort of send symbolic signals. And I think those symbols are, I imagine as a cultural anthropologist, you would find those symbols to be particularly important as to who belongs, who matters. And to me, I think they're also important in what it means to be a member of the society. So as a matter of what the Constitution, descriptive what the Constitution means now, they're fine. But I don't think they necessarily ought to be. I think they ought to be more constitutionally problematic, leaving aside my own individual perspective, but thinking more of it from a constitutional term.
Someone way back there.
A lot of conversations seem to be about terms in which they can couch. And the difference between the person who just actually persuades society what it feeds and the person who has a well-developed religious objection to a question is nothing when it comes to what the vote is. So I'm curious why, particularly Charles, why it's problematic that people get religious reasons or don't get religious reasons. It strikes me that in the California example, the problem is not that people are Mormon. The problem is that a lot of people who are also Mormon were gathering at their Mormon church and saying, we're going to fund this effort to eradicate the right to gay marriage. So why is it in any way improper to protest that at the site of organization?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, what you're saying is, look, it's the instrumental outcome that matters. It isn't the justifications for the outcome. Is that right?
Essentially, what people are going to organize around, at least in a pluralist society, is the outcome more than the rhetoric. A lot of people who are non-religious embrace King for reasons that may be religious and may not be. And the religious rhetoric seems somewhat misguided.
Well, again, two answers. I'm getting better at this, Jeff. One,
I'm still older.
I know that's unfair to hold that against me. The two answers. It would seem to me that one can't say to folks who are religious, look, you can be motivated by your religious views as long as they don't make a difference, right? That would seem to be, to me, would seem to be problematic. As long as you do what we want you to do, that's fine. But once you want to have an impact in the public square, then we're going to protest you. That seems to me to be a difficult principle to uphold. What I object to is not, I don't object to having an argument in the public square about outcomes, but I think once you start protesting churches and synagogues and mosques and whatever places of worship or gathering that have religious overtones, whatever those are for a person, then I think you really are having a significant infringement on religious liberty, because you are saying to people, if you gather in this, if you gather in this place, if you go back to my room analogy with one's kid, right? If you gather in this place where you're supposed to have full autonomy, and you make decisions and you decide to get involved in the public square on secular terms, right? Not on religious terms, on secular terms. So you could be motivated by your religion, but you're making secular arguments in the public square, and you decide to vote or you decide to contribute a particular way. If we don't like what is going on in that place, we are going to try to limit it or change it. If that's the case, and it seems to me that you don't have this notion of religious liberty at all, right? You might as well say to people, here's what you ought to believe, or completely stay out of the public square, even on secular grounds. So that's why I object to, if religious liberty means anything at all, then it seems to me going to those places of worship or whatever, however you want to describe them, and saying to people, we're going to try to limit your liberty at those places, then completely undermines, and from my perspective, this notion of religious liberty or right to worship as one pleases. So I agree that outcomes matter. There's no doubt about that. And I think we ought to debate outcomes, and that's why I said we ought to debate them on secular grounds, right, on secular terms, excuse me. But there should also be a right, it seems to me, to gather in one's place of worship and to make decisions on the basis of whatever you think your religious principles dictate.
You had your hand up?
I'm interested to see if, given both your perspectives, if you have examples of political figures who you personally feel have found this balance in terms of being able to be very devout in their faith, and that it's not a hidden secret, or in the case of JFK where he's putting his Catholic faith at the door, but they're very open about their faith and yet have found this balance of what we've been talking about through this whole discussion. And I guess I ask also because with the other examples with King, Warren, and Wright, they specifically have the title of being ministers, but I wonder what that looks like for a political figure.
Political figures.
I can give you negative examples. Let me give you what I think ought to be a controversial example. I think Lincoln, to my mind, actually successfully negotiated this difficult path, as I think King did. Although Lincoln, perhaps even more than King, was in a very strong sense making theological sort of arguments. I mean, if you go and read the great second inaugural, it is at heart a theological argument. Now, Lincoln was a one-man church, as it were. He wasn't an orthodox member of any particular religion. But that doesn't mean what he was saying wasn't deeply religious. And I think maybe he's a good example, from my perspective, of someone who made the judgment, I'm going to say how I envision what is going on in this country in that awful, important time. I'm going to tell you how I see it, and tell you how I see it personally given my, whatever it was, religious faith. And he didn't refrain from talking religiously, as I think Guy actually would have preferred him to do. And it would have been perfectly possible for people of many different viewpoints other than his to find what he said objectionable, precisely because it was couched theologically. So I think maybe he's a good example. The negative examples come, as I say, more easily to mind.
I always thought that the Caseys in Pennsylvania were interesting, the father and son, in some respects, because they clearly take their faith seriously. It clearly affects how they think about public policy. But I've also thought that they've tried to walk the line of not making public appeals about their faith, right? Simply saying, I believe this because it is the Catholic thing to do. So, to me, those were, both of them are interesting examples, and off the top of my head, the ones that I've always thought about and said, that would be worth looking at further and seeing, and have had, by all accounts, a tremendous impact in that state. People really like them now. Some might say, well, Pennsylvania is receptive more to Catholic thinking than other areas might be. But I think they seem to have walked that line pretty nicely.
President Powell, I see faith as a means, like function of faith as a means to reach a conclusion. But I also see that there are many other means to reach the same conclusions, such as via reasoning. If you're against the war because you don't think it's the will of God, or on that basis, is there not always another means to reach that same conclusion that includes and makes possible more debate in the public square? You see what I'm saying? It seems you should not be recused on the basis of the means you use to reach that conclusion. However, in order to include everyone from entering the question of policy or governance or things matter independent of our faith, why not choose that other means that includes all of us, such as reasoning? Or do you not see that possible?
It depends. For some religious folk, it is possible. For some religious folk, it's not. It is, in one fashion or another, the will of God. That's the determining reason. And my position is that, or my muddled position, is that one of the things we're trying to do is allow those people to be in public life and yet hold this religious belief that, no, I don't oppose the war because I think it a bad idea or because it violates UN or international law principles or something like that. I oppose the war because God opposes it. Period. I guess we have to stop.
Yeah, God told us to. Or David Levy did. I can't figure out which one.